I found a little bit of comfort. A small piece of bread which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. A lot of what happened in the Gulag camps was that, these people that were put in the camps were put into work brigades, and, so there was a huge canal that was dug in the Soviet Union. I believe it was in the 30s, and I don't remember the canal's name at the moment, unfortunately, but they killed 300,000 people in 3 months building it, and because they were pickaxing dirt in the brutal cold to build this canal, because it had to be done now, and, according to Solzhenitsyn's description, by the time they finished the canal, well, 300,000 people had died, but it was too shallow to be useful for the purpose they wanted to put it to, and so basically it was built but never used. And so then you think, well, what was the purpose of the canal if it was never used? And the answer to that is the purpose of the canal was to kill 300,000 people while they were working on it. And if you think that people can't have such purposes, then you're not thinking very hard, because they certainly can, and Stalin certainly did. Here's Solzhenitsyn's comments about work camps during the winter, and this is Russia, right? It's like Russia has winters. In cold, lower than 60 degrees below zero, work days were written off. In other words, on such days, the records showed that the workers had not gone out to work. But they chased them out anyway, and whatever they squeezed out of them on those days was added to the other days, thereby raising the percentages. And the servile medical section wrote off those who froze to death on such cold days on some other basis. And the ones who were left, who could no longer walk and were straining every sinew to crawl along on all fours on the way back to camp, the convoy simply shot so that they wouldn't escape before they could come back to get them. When I was studying this material, I was also looking at poetic representations of contamination and corruption and evil, and so I'm going to read you a poem from William Blake that seems to sum up the attitude that's necessary to harbor before you would be capable of doing such things. This is from the complete works of William Blake. O Rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm hath found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. This is something I took out of the Gulag Archipelago, the volume 2 of the Gulag Archipelago, which is an amazing book. The Gulag Archipelago itself is an unbelievable work of literature. It's phenomenal. It's an immense book. I think it's 2,700 pages long, and it's written in little tiny type, so it's 2,700 dense pages. And it records Solzhenitsyn's experiences of the concentration camp and the concentration camps, and the stories that he gathered, the individual stories that he gathered that describe it qualitatively. But Solzhenitsyn also made an attempt to put the camps, to write a history of the camps, and also a history of the political and social institutions that gave rise to them, but at the same time a psychological analysis of the conditions that made these camps possible and probable. And he identified the fundamental problem in the Soviet Union as the willingness of the Soviet citizens to lie to themselves and to each other on a constant and ongoing basis. So to some degree it's a reflection of the idea that I told you about before of the instrumental use of language. Language was something to hide your true self behind, not something to communicate about. And people were very unwilling to discuss anything that might be considered a shortcoming of the system in any way possible, no matter how bad the system got and no matter how bad they were suffering. Because by definition, the system was always already perfect, right? Utopia had already come. And what that meant was that if you were suffering, and it was utopia, there obviously was something seriously wrong with you. And the best thing to do with a creature that was as seriously gone astray as you was to get rid of them, and often in the most brutal way that could possibly be imagined. And so that happened to lots of people. In East Germany, they estimated that 1 out of every 3 people was a government informer. So the lie, and this is Solzhenitsyn's analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union, he didn't believe that any of that could happen unless the entire citizenry had made an unspoken pact that they were never ever going to say anything that was true to each other or to themselves under any circumstances whatsoever. and he believed that that was the precondition. You know, I've already mentioned these sorts of phenomena are very complicated, but he believed that that was the precondition for the absolute corruption of the state. And that's really worth thinking about, you know. And Solzhenitsyn also said, and I think this was in his Nobel Prize speech, but it might have been his Harvard address, because he was invited to speak at graduation at Harvard. And the newspapers ripped him apart, by the way, because he was quite critical of Western society, despite the fact that he had been granted asylum in Vermont. You know, and it was so interesting to read the criticisms, because, you know, even people who should have known a hell of a lot better, you know, like smart people, were very irritated at Solzhenitsyn for daring to say that there was anything wrong with the West, given that he had been granted asylum, you know, by the Americans in Vermont. I personally thought they were lucky to get him, you know, and I think that's the right attitude towards someone like him. But anyways, so the book itself, the Gulag Archipelago, the second volume is mostly personal experiences of one form or another, and it's, you know, enough to, well, you've read some of it hypothetically, you know, it's an unbelievably brilliant book. But the 3 volumes together, you know, 2,700 pages, they're almost unbearable, because they're written by someone who's basically screaming at the top of his lungs for like 2,700 pages.